Okay, Ruan O Donnell, bevaram tús a choir I'd like to begin the night agus ma bhuachas a gháil anna chodíine a chóirí glom agus a chóirí leis a glór le an na hair an chun imachtaí mar seo a chur siúl. So I'd like just to thank people before I start on the introductions and who helped me and who helped the program in Irish Studies to put on events like this. This night, of course, has been made possible because of contributions from people like you through the Friends of Irish Studies and the Irish Studies programme. I also would like to thank the Fulbright Commission, who we've worked with to bring Professor O'Donnell over. And I'd also like to thank Sam and Julie Baldridge for their contributions to the history programme. And hopefully we look forward to having more evenings like this where we'll have speakers keeping us informed of different aspects of Irish history, in particular the contribution of the Irish of America towards the course of Irish history and changing the fortunes of Irish history. It's a great honour for me to be here tonight, particularly to introduce Professor Ruan O Donnell, because Professor O'Donnell came here last year to deliver the President's lecture, and he left a great impression on an awful lot of people over here. I was very fortunate to be able to work with the Fulbright Commission and with the help again from donation granted by Sam and Julie Baldridge to bring Professor O'Donnell over here. He currently teaches 2 courses in Irish history. He's a tremendous scholar. He's a scholar that a lot of people in Ireland don't like, because they don't like him because he likes to go to primary sources, access the material, the words that were written by those who were involved in creating the history of Ireland and making them public. A lot of people in Ireland find that very uncomfortable. There's a kind of an official narrative that we should accept, even though when sometimes their official narratives can give you indigestion. Professor O'Donnell has been one of those who's been trying to relieve us of having to consume that narrative, and he has caused quite a bit of controversy. But the thing about him, he is a tremendous scholar. He's a scholar of the old school. He goes to the primary resource, and that has been recognised as well in the many books that he has written, particularly in Irish nationalism, Irish republicanism, and the troubles in Northern Ireland. Of course, the troubles in Northern Ireland go way back in history and involve other aspects and other movements, going back even as far back as the time of the United Irishmen, down through the Young Irelanders. As you know, the former acting governor of the state, Thomas Francis Meagher, was the spokesperson for the Young Ireland movement. The Fenians, we'll talk about tonight, and right down to the present day. Professor O'Donnell was the former head of history at the University of Limerick. He's a member of the Commission. He's been the editor, co-editor, writing 100 different volumes. So he is a tremendous scholar, a great speaker, and it's a great honour to be here tonight to introduce Professor Ruan O Donnell. Oh, and one last thing I want to let you know, because I forgot to mention this to Professor O'Donnell. We are being recorded, so be on your best behaviour. And we're being recorded because we have received a grant from Missoula Community Access Television. This is a media assistance grant which they've made to Irish Studies to record this event, which we'll show to our students in class. So this night will be passed on to other students. So our thanks to MCAT as well. Now, tá mochohan right the gumsa so bevalum so and told Ruan O Donnell a court in Orlaher. Professor O'Donnell, the floor is yours. I'm off the air.
Well, thanks for that very comprehensive and kind introduction. Well, if you think it's warm here, it's going to start getting a lot hotter. Talking about the Fenians in Ireland is always controversial, because they represent a high point of the physical force tradition, which is one of several popular movements that were striving to improve the condition of the Irish in their own country with the assistance of those who were located overseas, most particularly North America and predominantly in the United States of America. But Canada was also important, but not as important as the US. The topic is not well understood. I've never seen a single volume that I think adequately covers the broad complexities of what was an international movement known for shorthand as the Fenians. Now, as I explained, that term is not entirely satisfactory, but it's the best one we have. And I'll deal with that in a minute. On a personal note, I just want to echoes some of the things that Trelloch said there. I also am grateful to the Irish Studies programme here, which has got a tremendous cohort of people supporting it, the UM and the Fulbright Commission. Otherwise, I couldn't be here. It's been quite an interesting semester. I've met some very good friends. I've cemented relationships with people I met last year. I'm looking forward to keeping this going for as long as I'm overground. Suffice to say, the Fenians in Irish America are indivisible. You cannot write about the Fenians without talking about the US. But I suppose if I have to pick one rough period of a starting point, it would be on Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, which we inadequately call sometimes the Irish Famine, or the Great Irish Famine. But please never call it the Potato Famine. Please don't do that. In years to come, it's going to be increasingly spoken of as an act of genocide. Because certainly under modern definitions post-World War II, it qualifies for modern definitions of genocide. There are people who insist that there was no intent to kill 1.2 million people and drive half the population across the Atlantic, but in actuality there was. And there's actually quite a substantial amount of evidence that's exactly what they wanted to do. They had a very coherent plan. In fact, Nassau Senior was rather disappointed that only 1.2 million people died. They were hoping for 2, because that would make the transformation of the landholding system a little bit more efficacious. So having parked that atrocity just there, you have to remember or imagine, and all we can do is imagine, how that would have impacted the generation who survived. By 1900, you're looking at an Ireland where the bulk of the race has gone. It's predominantly gone to the urban cities of the United Kingdom, to Australasia, in exotic pockets such as Argentina and South Africa, but overwhelmingly to the Canadian seaboard in as far as Western Ontario, the populated parts, in other words, and across all the United States. In the period 1840s, mid-1840s to the end of the 1850s, roughly speaking, between 30 and 50% of everyone in the world coming to America came from Ireland, which is quite remarkable if you think about that. There were 60,000 people a year coming before the 1845 collapse of the rural economy. Irish were the biggest foreign-born element in the United States during the American Revolutionary War, and around about 40% of Washington's army was Irish-born, not counting Irish Americans who were already very strongly established. There's a very interesting story about where we came from, because we were here with the Spanish in Mexico, we were here with the French in what became British North America. There are Irish merchants amongst the first people who founded some of the colonies with the Dutch on the East Coast. It's not a straightforward narrative, but we came here in large numbers and we kept coming. And there's no other single people that mirrors that. The rough shorthand term German, which is interesting and important and largely language orientated as opposed to national, there aren't many German Americans who aren't also Irish Americans and vice versa. And there was also substantial Irish intermarriage with people of Italian, of Polish heritage, and in the New York sector also with people of Jewish heritage. There's quite a lot, more than you might think, you might imagine, including members of my own family in the Lower East Side of New York. So An Gorta Mór was an existential threat, and it convinced many people that there was no path to survival, let alone emancipation, let alone common decency, let alone ambitious forward momentum in life. In July 1848, as is well known, or not that well known perhaps here, the Young Ireland organisation, which Trelloch mentioned, staged what has been aptly described, in my opinion, as an armed protest. The rising itself had been preempted by martial law. So martial law was in place before they tried to mobilise. Maher realised that the city poor of Dublin would make such a good showing that they wouldn't be able to control the situation. The narrative could become exceptionally ferocious, and he decided not to mobilise the Dublin city people. Father Kenyon in Northern Tipperary also effectively stood down very substantial sectors where Young Ireland were well embodied. So what you see is by no means an index of the capacity of Young Ireland. It's a preempted and partially abolished armed protest, and not an insurrection. The British knew that, and that's why they did not move standing military forces in the way that which they were perfectly capable of doing against mobilised bodies of men. So instead of having pitched battles with large loss of life, you have skirmishing and evasions, and then basically speaking, nearly all the fighters are allowed go home. And someone came out again the following year, but let's not worry about that. The leadership had to be richly sentenced to death, and they were. But there's no intention of executing them, because that would have made a bad situation even worse. So immediately, their sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life. In actuality, that isn't as ferocious as that may sound in 1848. You're essentially being sent into exile in Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. You weren't going to be out in a convict chain gang in chains. That just did not happen. These were, by the way, gentlemen convicts. They're people from merchant families like the Mahers. They're journalists like John Mitchell. They're scholars like John O'Mahony. Those who escaped arrest included James Stephens, who was wounded in fighting in Tipperary. The local nationalist newspaper very obligingly reported him dead. We gave him more time to get off scene to Paris. And in Paris, and then very quickly later on New York, you have a recoalescence of the surviving elements of that cadre of Young Ireland. They were reinforced within 5 or 10 years by their escaping comrades who found it relatively straightforward to get off Van Diemen's Land with Irish-American assistance. Mitchell himself, of course, Maher famously, but not just him. Most of those who wished to escape did so. The only significant one who didn't get it right was William Smith O'Brien, but that's another story. So, if you've survived that experience, are you going to be reconciled to an imperial government that has created this calamity, the Great Calamity? Well, Ireland from the 1st of January 1801 was bound into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. That could have been a very successful union, much in the way the Scottish Union was relatively successful. Except that was not the way the English were disposed to make it operate. They deindustrialised Ireland, they reduced its population, remained unenfranchised. Catholic emancipation wasn't even legal until 1829. Nonconformist Protestants who were often overlooked in Ireland, and we had substantial numbers of those, they weren't emancipated in Britain until 1828. So you have a sectarian tyranny of the Anglican landed elite over everybody else. You've got no written constitution, no Bill of Rights. You have a monarchy that is circumscribed by the oligarchs, but otherwise is rampant and tyrannical. You have no interest in raising the quality of life of people. Only since the 1830s was anything like a poor law, which is some very robust form of basic, tough, muscular social welfare. The version that they imposed on Ireland later on was deliberately inferior to the English version. People made those decisions. So what are you going to do? What if you aspired to a French-style Republican democracy, or for us, a better fit, American-style Republican democracy, which is what we aspired to? America had what we wanted, and we were part of it, we were cognizant of it, and we aspired to it seriously and assiduously over years. Well, part of the impact of the removal of literally millions of Irish people in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way into the first decade of the 1900s, millions now, draining the country of over half its population, making a population of 9 million in 1845, would dip below 4 million in the early years of the 1900s, which is quite shocking, with the vast majority of those people being here, some of whom perhaps are your own ancestors. Suffice it to say that you have the creation of urban ghettos. Population of New York doubled, population of Boston tripled, population of Toronto doubled due to Irish migration. Every other city was also inundated, anyone you could think of. All the big cities of the East Coast, all the way down to New Orleans, all the way with the migrations, which had started with the Irish in the 1820s into the Midwest and what became Illinois and Chicago, they're all heavily, heavily reinforced by migrants. Portland, Oregon became a major Irish centre in the early 1900s. Denver, about 1 person in 6 was born in Ireland. Very quickly, this state became, depending where you are, between 20 and 25% ethnic Irish, which is more than any other single ethnicity and quite substantial. Now, they had organisation. There were groups like the Asian Order of Hibernians, the Fenians known as St. Patrick, other smaller groups, the Irish National Foresters, who you may not have heard of, but are similar. You even had the ancient Irish and Scottish Rite Masons. You had various social and cultural organisations that bound people together. And if you're looking at the major cities like Philadelphia, like New York, like Boston, well, not so much in terms of size, but in terms of its legacy, they were very coherent and obvious and organised. They had their own newspapers, they had their own way of doing business. So this was the resource that could be drawn upon by Irish revolutionaries to get this thing done in our own country. And the British knew it. They referred to this factor as the wolf dog of Irish vengeance. That sort of puts it on us, by the way, but at least they recognised that there might be a need for something like vengeance. Well, we didn't want to do that. When you read the documents produced by the Fenian Brotherhood, and I'm going to read one later on, in the second or third hour of my talk. Let's sink in for a second there. I caught you, eh? What you see is, they wanted things like a constitution, universal suffrage, separation of church and state. They wanted all things you didn't have in England and didn't have in Ireland. Now, if you didn't have it in England, that's a problem. But if you didn't have it in Ireland, you might die, because the government might kill you, right, through deliberate and malevolent inaction and hostile policies. They made it quite clear. They wanted to advantage the urban working poor of the Midlands of England, who were reliant on subsidised Irish food, and it didn't matter if the extra labourers involved in producing that food died or moved. And they're happy enough if you went to Liverpool and Manchester or Glasgow. That was fine. But they don't want you on the land in Ireland. right? A lot of the so-called counter-famine initiatives were about depopulating the rural societies, right? Estate clearances, conditions of receipt of very, very rudimentary social welfare. So over here, we want what you had, and we were aware of it. Now, I normally don't have a script, and I'm not going to read a script, don't worry about that. That would take 2 hours. But I want to touch on some of the key points that led to the emergence, the manifestation of Fenianism. Well, the Republican ideology there is quite simple. It is a revised version of that of Young Ireland of 1848, which was self-consciously and deliberately a re-articulation of that of the United Irishmen of 1791, and then, of course, the 1708 Rebellion and the 1803 aftershock led by Robert Emmet, whose brother Thomas Addis Emmet was a very close friend of Thomas Jefferson, of the Riker family in New York, and really a man moving in the first echelons of emigrant Irish society on the East Coast, not least being Attorney General of New York State during the War of 1812. So this is the level of people we're dealing with here. People like Wolfe Tone knew Franklin. Some of his friends knew Washington. Washington was very well disposed towards the Irish in this country. Quite an important, interesting man himself in terms of Ireland. They wanted to revive that Republic agenda and achieve the type of settlement that had been won here by force of arms against the Redcoats. The French version was deemed to be a little bit extreme in places because, for instance, they nationalised all church property. And that's quite a step. That's quite a step. That wasn't going to play well in Ireland, which is basically more socially conservative, right? Now, parts of France were socially conservative, but basically speaking, they went quite far in terms of separation of church and state. They nearly abolished the church. Now, that wouldn't have suited us, but many leading members of Young Ireland and of the Fenians were Protestants. So it's not about a Catholic Protestant thing, not at all. It's about self-determination and national democracy. Some of the key figures I mentioned before, James Stephens. There's a man who really deserves a proper biography. There's nothing adequate on Stephens, and one could be written. John O'Mahony, also there's some books on him, but not enough, need more. But these two men had conferred on how to do this. They did this in the left bank of Paris in the 1840s, and then they did it in New York, and they did it via emissaries. O'Mahony had migrated to the US by 1854, and possibly as early as 1853, and he'd heard that his old comrade John Mitchell had escaped from Tasmania. Now, Mitchell is worthy of a mini-series of his own right, but my favourite story about him is he's believed to be the only man imprisoned for treason by both sides of the American Civil War. So he's doing something interesting. The key figure in New York was Michael Doheny, a Tipperary lawyer. Now, Doheny is another exiled leader at 48. He was the linchpin on what became known as the Emmet Monument Association, the EMA, Emmet Monument Association. Now, that's not to build a memorial to Emmet. Following Robert Emmet's famous speech from the dock, his searing speech from the dock, which people like Abraham Lincoln knew by heart, because it's one of the finest pieces of oratory ever written in the English language, he wanted his memorial to be not an epitaph, but the Republic, the achievement of the Irish Republic. Hence that ironic and not too subtle allusion, Emmet Monument Association. Now, Doheny pulled together a group of people who are quite interesting. They don't often get named, but I'm going to do it for a second. Thomas J. Kelly, Michael Corcoran, James Roach, Oliver Byrne, and Patrick O'Rourke. Between them, they also founded the 69th New York City Militia, famously the corpus of the Irish Brigade, at one point led by Michael Corcoran and latterly by Thomas Francis Maher. They utilised the structures of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and the officer cadre of the 69th was put together in the Hibernian Hall, which is just across from Old St. Patrick's, very near the residence of Bishop Dagger Hughes. The man who, when threatened with racist know-nothing, said, if you burn one of our churches, we'll burn all of yours. So that put pay to that problem. These guys were in communication with their allies who had crept back to Ireland. Stephens himself had undertaken a very arduous fact-finding tour on foot in the 1850s, when he still technically a wanted man. And some people have estimated he may have walked 5,000 miles. Now, you can't really go more than 400 miles in Ireland without falling into the sea or tripping over something that's going to make you drown. So to traverse 5,000 miles means he was up, down every backway, byroad, hamlet and hilltop that we have. Quite an endeavour. Emissaries were sent in both directions. One was Owen Constantine, and another was Joseph Deneath. And in the case of Deneath, he crossed the Atlantic multiple times. What did they have in their favour with these emissaries? Well, one was the frequency of traffic, commercial and passenger transport between Ireland and North America. There'll be nearly daily sailings to places like Limerick and Derry. It's not just Dublin and Cork, so there was a lot of stuff going on. Moreover, steam power. Steam power meant that it was quite quick and increasingly affordable. So you could traverse more than one might imagine they did in those particular times. So O'Mahony was irritated by the lack of focused revolutionary sentiment being marshalled in the United States, and this is exactly what himself and Stephen decided to redress. And because of this, following consultations, on St. Patrick's Day, the 17th of March, 1858, the Irish Republican Brotherhood was founded in Dublin, and was founded by people who inducted each other in a very significant ceremony, as per arrangement with New York. And what they were doing is a joint refoundation of the Irish Republican movement. So effectively, the kernel of the Eminent Monument Association, there were other groups too, but they were the most important, became the Fenian Brotherhood. And the Irish annex was the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They're both called Fenians, right? And the Fenians is the correct term for them. They're also known later on in this country as Clan na Gael. Clan na Gael is a rebranded and refocused Fenian Brotherhood, and members of the clan were called Fenians. You know what I mean? They're called other things too, but I'll come to that, particularly by the British. However, the Seamus McManus, who was a very well-informed and world-famous Irish literary historian, said the American movement, from the beginning, affiliated with the movement at home. So this is a joint common foundation. Now, why do they do it? Why do they go to such elaborate ceremony? Well, one reason was, in my opinion, this mirrored the way in which the United Irishmen had come into being, jointly founded in Dublin and Belfast in October, November 1791, with persons in that instance present at both meetings. Now, the 3,500 miles of the Atlantic made that a little bit more hazardous, but they were basically founded as two branches. The strategic role of the American side was something that led to problems, particularly in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. But effectively, they were to enable the Irish to act, because they could operate fairly openly here with some obvious caveats. They could print whatever they wanted effectively. They could raise money openly. They could train in arms. They could acquire weaponry. And they did all of those things, which was not possible in Ireland, where you're subject to police surveillance, interdiction, infiltration, and arrest. The Treason Felony Act of 1848 technically made it illegal to discuss Ireland becoming a republic. You could be technically prosecuted for discussing Ireland becoming a republic. And if they really wanted to push it, they could claim that that was encompassing the death of the king, which is the definition of high treason. Not just treason, but high treason, if you're going to remove the head of the state. Well, many Fenians wanted to literally remove the head of the state. Let's not be bashful about this, as had the defenders, as had the United Irishmen, as had 1848 veterans. There's no love for the British monarchy in Ireland, apart from some of their colonial, I suppose, former allies. Well, less said about them, the better. Fenians is from Irish history, it's from our sagas, it's from McCool, it's connected to the Oceanic cycle. O'Mahony was a scholar. This is largely, we believe, down to him. But the concept is of Irish warriors. Irish warriors focused on bringing the Republic into being. Now, just to give you a little bit of constructive confusion, they call themselves many names all the time, and they did this quite deliberately. Many Fenian documents are marked VC, and that's nothing to do with Queen Victoria. Let me assure you of that. VC is a very basic progressive letter substitution for UB, one letter on each case, right? And UB stands for United Brotherhood, which is another term for the Fenian Brotherhood, and that was designed to echo United Irishmen. So there's a lot of Masonic style sort of subterfuge and intricacy going on here. And yes, and they did have secret signs, they did have secret handshakes, there were methods of recognition with total strangers, and there are accounts of guys down working on the ranches in Chile and Argentina recognizing each other as Fenians because of all of this. It's a fascinating story, which I'm only going to be able to barely touch on. Now I'm going to read you their oath, because their oath tells you something about what they were telling people, their own adherents, what the game was. I, AB, that's AB is standard for, you put your name in there. If you want to swear the oath now, silently work away. Do solemnly swear the presence of Almighty God that I will do my utmost at every risk while life lasts to make Ireland an independent democratic republic, that I will yield implicit obedience in all things not contrary to the law of God, to the commands of my superior officers, and that I shall preserve inviolable secrecy regarding all transactions of the secret society that may be confided in me. So help me God, amen. Now that's a subversive, seditious oath. That was illegal. Taking that oath made one vulnerable in Britain or Ireland to prosecution. Now, they had structures. The structures were basically based on circles or groups of 9 persons who would elect a sergeant. The sergeants would elect a captain. Those officers were known as A, B, and C. C standing for centre, as well as the letter C, by the way. The upper command structure was not elected from below. This is precisely what the United Irishmen did using groups of 12. They just moved it to 9, okay? As with the United Irishmen, the upper leadership was comprised of people of lifelong interaction and family connection. In other words, Maher knew, someone like Maher knew they could trust someone like James Stephens. Stephens knew he could trust O'Mahony. And quite a small group of people are the inner workings of everything on both sides of the Atlantic and in the UK, where due to the strength of the Irish diaspora in the UK, the Fenians became very strong. More of that later. Now, the stock of the Fenian Brotherhood in the US rose considerably on the 11th of October 1860. I see this family are back in the news today. I'm alluding to the house of Saxe-Coburg, who pretend to call themselves Windsors these days. Colonel Michael Corcoran refused to parade the 69th Regiment to review the so-called Prince of Wales. The Prince of Wales wasn't called that in Wales in those days. He wasn't very popular. He was a nasty piece of work, by the way, the particular one. And Corcoran's refusal of a direct order to parade the Fighting 69th, as they later became known, was obviously hugely significant. Many of the militias there are Irish, and some of them are called the Fenians Brigades. Many of the Irish brigades have the number 9 in them, or the number 6. And the 6 is not number 6, it's the inverted 9. And this is part of their revolutionary iconography. So, for instance, you might have a 99th Regiment, but not a 100th, and there was never a 98th. So 69, 99, and you'll see that in Ohio, you see it in Illinois, you see it in Massachusetts, you see it in New York. The Fenian regiments use the number 9 frequently and deliberately. Not exclusively, but you'll see it more than you might expect. Now, for that, of course, he was censured, but the stock of the Fenian Brotherhood rocketed because now someone's standing up to the shower of foreign dastards who are destroying our country. And it was very, very popular indeed with a considerable Irish community. On the 10th of November 1861, Terence Bellew McManus did the best thing he ever did by dying. He was buried in Dublin, having been brought back in a terrible state of repair from San Francisco, toured the length and breadth of this country, put in and around the Mechanical Institute in Dublin, carted up the length of the city to Glasnevin Cemetery, and put down in the ground as a centrepiece of the new Republican plot in Glasnevin, which now holds many subsequent Irish revolutionaries. Now, that was a feat of propaganda, a feat of organisation, and let's just say that the memory of the dead was put to good use right there. And the Catholic Church, the hierarchy, were vehemently opposed to Fenians because of their proposal to separate church and state. They were described as godless. They weren't. They simply believed that personal faith, which is a very admirable thing in Irish society, according to most, should be a matter for your private life and is no business of the state. Half our problems emanate from the fact that the British have pretensions to join their established church to their state and the person of the monarch. So this is one of the reasons why more than 80% of the Irish population were automatically viewed as disloyal because they wouldn't convert to the religion of the monarch. So that made you some sort of subversive threat. So the burial of McManus was a triumph. 3,000 people in paramilitary uniform paraded him down to Glasnevin Cemetery on a very circuitous route. And there's nothing the authorities could do to stop it. Well, they could have tried, but it was going to end in tears. And it wouldn't just be the marchers carted off in stretchers, let's put it that way. So Doherty and O'Mahony represented the American wing of the organisation and were very impressed with the way in which people like Stephens had pulled it off. Now, Republicans have done things like this many times since, but this was the single most important instance to date of utilising the 1848 heroes to revivify their contemporary people. That's not amazing. No. Well, the other thing they did in 1863 is they began to found to firm up the structure of the American side of the organisation. Now, this is quite complicated, and I'm going to really reduce it to an inadequate thumbnail sketch, okay? Because it would just take too long to go through how much was going on here. The first major convention was held of the National Fenian Organisation was held in Chicago in November 1863. Now, everyone in this room will be aware that the American Civil War was then on. You'll probably be aware that more than 200,000 Irishmen took part in the American Civil War, predominantly, overwhelmingly, in the Union Army, but also a fair number in the Confederate forces, those who had settled in the South. I mean, the famous Louisiana Tigers were one of their Southern Confederate regiments. Another very famous one was in Georgia, and there's more than that. Confederate serving officers were allowed to come from the Southern Front and were given free passage to attend the Fenian Congress in Chicago. And this was happening the length and breadth of the country on the battlefields. The Irish situation was viewed as bipartisan by all American authorities. Jefferson Davis, for instance, by the way, not the most favoured person these days, but he was very significantly impressed by Ireland, and his daughter wrote a very famous biography of Robert Emmet. They were interested, they were connected. Both Jeb Stuart and Stonewall Jackson had Irish background, and famously Grant, Meade, Sheridan were also of recent Irish heritage in this country in the Union Army. So throughout that war, the Fenians were allowed to organise cadres within the Confederate forces and in particular in the Union Army. Many of the regiments I told you had been specifically raised as Fenian regiments, but they were using the militia system to gain acceptance by the authorities in this country. Stevens himself was allowed to tour the Union Army and recruit openly in the forces of, I suppose you call them the Bluecoats, right? So a lot of things were happening here, which are very interesting. They met again in Cincinnati, Ohio in January 1864. At that time, O'Mahony said that the Fenian Brotherhood was, quote, virtually at war with the British Empire. And this is where things start to go pear-shaped. They're anticipating the Union victory. And that was on the cards for a while before it took place, and the last sort of vestiges of the conflict, that horrible conflict, petered out. And they knew that would be their opportunity to utilise their veterans and those they could draw to their standards to do something in Ireland. A factional struggle arose whereby some Fenians here were proposing that the best way to attack British interests would be to attack British North America. Because what could be achieved there? Well, one thing is they weren't confederated, so they didn't have a common defence policy. The borders along the Great Lakes frontier and all the way out to Oregon were not finalised, and many of these border sectors are subject to ongoing disputes between DC and the British authorities. The British did not have an effective standing army in Canada. They had various militias and yeomanries and things like that. The Fenians would have made short work of them. And when they went at it, they did make short work of them. So the basic premise of, can we attack the British in North America? Yes. Similarly, they want to dispose of French Canadians to get off their asses and fight for themselves again. In other words, to create something like Quebec became. There was no Quebec in those days. They were part of one of the provinces of Ontario, which was then several provinces. So this wasn't pie in the sky, but here's what it was not. It was not direct revolutionary action in Ireland itself. And of course, that led to a problem. Who gets the resources? If you send guys to attack deep into the Fort Erie and the lake system up there, should we not be embarking them on steamships to fight in Ireland? Because that's what they joined up for. And now we're redeploying them in a different manner. And they never quite got over that. But the key thing to bear in mind is this. That is a question of tactics and strategy. It is not a question of ideology. They were all on the same page. The objective remained the independent Irish Republic. Now, just to summarise a bit more, the British knew this was coming. Not stupid. They had their sources. The upper command tier of the Fenians was not compromised, but some of the mid-command tiers and people around the upper leadership were problematic. They were infiltrated in this country by British agents, and they were also infiltrated in the UK and in Ireland itself. In September 1865, they launched a preemptive crackdown against the obvious intellectual leadership in Dublin, of the IRB, when people like Jeremiah Donovan Rossa, James Stephens himself were arrested, and many others. They were arrested. It was because the draconian laws under treason, felony, etc., were so severe, if they wanted to put you in jail, they could. And later they went the whole hog and suspended habeas corpus. And later, fearing that the Irish militia, which had stood intact from 1793, that was too vulnerable to Fenian infiltration, they stood down the entire Irish militia, which is remarkable, because that meant you only then had the professional army, which was also disproportionately Irish everywhere. So this is a knock on their heads. Stephens was rescued. The Union hero and founder member of the EMA, Thomas J. Kelly, and others, and John Devoy, of whom more on and in different lectures, Devoy and Kelly were involved in springing Stephens from Richmond jail and springing him over to France. He later came to the United States. That was quite a feat. In the course of 1866, at least 500 Fenian Brotherhood members moved in small groups to Ireland, where they were acting as training officers for the Irish-based Fenians. So you'd have Irish-American guys arriving, had all seen action. In some cases, they'd been through hellish confrontations of a level the British Army hadn't been used to fighting. The British Army at this point hadn't been using machine guns on each other and things like that. So these were tough guys. A lot of them were rounded up, but a lot of them were not. And you will read accounts of guys wearing paramilitary-style uniforms being found wandering around Cavan and Leitrim, right, the real deep heart of rural Ireland. They were there. Some of them were arrested, but they weren't being prosecuted and they weren't being identified. That was a vanguard. That was a forward effort. At times, it was spoken of perhaps sending 5, 6, 7, 8,000 men to Ireland under the guise of touring parties, of innocent purpose, weapons sent separately, all of that. That didn't happen, but it was feasible. And the Advance Party proved that it was technically possible to send your combatants to Ireland and help the inherent structures in that country. But as I mentioned, the British were somewhat aggravated, they were somewhat motivated, and they did manage to preempt some of the maturation of Fenian conspiracies, of which there were many. And today I'm only going to mention 4 or 5 of them to give you a flavour, then I'm going to let you go home. Unless you storm out and protest in the meantime. Please don't. In the course of 1866, while this is going on, those adhering to the Roberts tendency, the Roberts faction of the Fenian Brotherhood in the United States, including the famous General Tom Sweeney, the commander of the Midwestern Irish Brigade, we saw a lot of activity in the Midwest and all the way down into Missouri. These were capable people. Sweeney and Roberts decided they're going to option the Canadian assault tactic. They started doing this in April '66, when John O'Mahony mobilised 700 Fenians up on the coast of Maine to threaten the British-held Campobello Island. Now, word got to Halifax, Nova Scotia, that the Fenians are about to cross and invade and take Campobello Island, and they had to mobilise emergency fashion the Royal Navy there, put to sea to stop that happening. Now that is designed to provoke an international incident between the United States and that loose coalition of territories that is still not Canada in British North America. It was narrowly averted. I've seen accounts of this were described as a fiasco. It was a political triumph. You don't have to take to the field and bayonet your enemy to be engaged in a political struggle. There's more than one way of doing this. And they were pressing the buttons of DC, and they're irritating London. And this is why Canada did confederate. The next major thrust came on the 31st of May and the 1st of June, 1866, when men bearing badges that said Irish Republican Army, IRA, and the IRA is the Fenian Brotherhood at war. And that's why the IRA, ever since, are Fenians, because they're the lineal descendants of the Fenian Brotherhood, something that many Irish scholars don't like to acknowledge because it tends to confer a sense of legitimacy on respected organisations versus one in the 1970s and 80s we're all taught to hate or to fear, right? The same organisation. And I'll give you more examples of that later on. Now this thrust in May-June was very short. It was led by Colonel John O'Neill, another senior officer in the American Civil War, and he brought around about 1,500 men over the border, and for 2 or 3 days they kicked the living Jesus out of the Canadian militia, took Fort Erie, routed the elite Toronto Royalist militia at the Battle of Ridgeway, which some accounts hilariously describe as a British victory. They were humiliated. And you'll see reports again of, ill-prepared militia. This was the best militia in Canada. And they couldn't believe how easily they'd been defeated by these very tough Irish and Irish Americans. Kicked their asses. The US government was very concerned, because, oh my God, our friends have invaded Canada. What are we going to do about this? You know, we haven't decided where we're going to put the border in Oregon, but this is a bit much, isn't it? So basically speaking, they seized their supply bases in Buffalo, in Oswego, and other locations in upstate and western New York. It's a very important story, tends to get overlooked or perhaps discounted. The British decided to do something that hitherto refused to do. And very quickly, they paid reparations to the US government for aiding the Confederacy in the American Civil War. Now, what's not often spoken about is this. The British permitted Confederate agents to operate down into Vermont and Maine and New York, as far as Manhattan, where they said they were responsible for a spate of arson attacks, to attack the Union cause, to try and divert Union troops to garrison duties on the eastern seaboard. So the American authorities knew they were doing this. They knew they were doing this. They knew who was behind it. And basically, they demanded millions in compensation. It's not just building ships to the Confederacy. It's not just messing around with the cotton embargo. It's much more than that. It's actual physical attacks on the sovereignty of the United States. So suddenly, they began to pay the money. So in a series of manoeuvres, Grant himself and Meade himself and later Sheridan were deployed to go up and ask their former subordinates, would you please come back and stop shooting the Canadians? In many cases, they were given their passage home. Their weaponry was returned to them. Sweeney was still on the active general list, by the way, and other senior Fenian officers of general rank were temporarily taken off the US Army list to give some sort of a veneer that the authorities didn't approve. They did. But the thing was that Fenians could have gone much further. They didn't manage to coordinate it. Ultimately, you could have seen 5, 6, 8,000 different groups of Fenians attacking all the way across the frontier. And ultimately, what you have is a small-scale skirmishing war that goes on right the way into 1871. And by then, the US authorities were losing patience and would pursue them into Canadian territories and bring them back, including the said John O'Neill, who'd already dishonoured his parole not to invade Canada again. Manitoba was the last thrust in 1871, so it's all the way across the frontier. Meanwhile, the Fenians in Ireland had decided that 1867 would be their year, that they had to go for it. And this again is something that is a little bit hard to describe because it's so disjointed. So the IRB stirred first on the 14th of February 1867, when Kerry Fenians, very close, in the Ring of Kerry, by the way, a beautiful part of the country and a place that often features on this man's tours, so bear that in mind. And it's not just Dingle, but Dingle's fantastic. Menaced Killarney. And they probably would have attacked Killarney had the garrison not already turned out to wait for them. So they said, okay, well, we won't do it tonight. What did they do? They went home. They went home and waited for a better day. The day that came was the 5th of March, 1867, which was the day that was meant to be the eruption of a major guerrilla war. Now, not a pitched battle against standing British forces. You weren't going to win. They'll kill you. But to create considerable mayhem on a scale, and that did not materialise. But I want to read something to you. They issued, being gentlemen revolutionaries, they issued a statement to the Times of London and other press agencies to make certain that they weren't going to be misconstrued. Now, I won't read all of it, but I'll give you a flavour of it. The Irish people of the world, it's entitled. We have suffered centuries of outrage, enforced poverty, and bitter misery. Our rights and liberties have been trampled on by an alien aristocracy who, treating us as foes, usurped our lands and drew away from our unfortunate country all material riches. The real owners of the soil were removed to make room for cattle and driven across the ocean to seek means of living and the political rights denied to them at home, while men of thought and action were condemned to loss of life and liberty. But we never lost the memory and hope of a national existence. We appealed in vain to the reason and sense of justice of the dominant powers. Our mildest remonstrances were met with sneers and contempt. Our appeals were always unsuccessful. Now it goes on this, right? All men are born with equal rights, and in associating to protect one another and share public burdens, justice demands that such associations should rest upon a basis which maintains equality instead of destroying it. We therefore decree that, unable to endure the curse of monarchical government, we aim at founding a republic based on universal suffrage, which shall secure to all the intrinsic value of their labour. This goes on. We declare also in favour of absolute liberty of conscience and complete separation of church and state. Now, there's more to it. That is an emphatically modern, progressive, democratic document. It was completely revolutionary and illegal. Everything they're saying was against the law. You're not allowed to have any of that. Okay? And Ireland didn't get any of that until well into the 20th century, after another more successful war of national liberation. Now, the 1867 uprising was, let's be honest, quite disastrous. It's to do with bad luck, launching in atrocious weather, which makes a difference in those times, communications breakdown, the prowess of the Irish Constabulary, who then were given the royal prefix to reward them for being good at being paramilitary police. It was marked by discoordination. We don't know the whole story, but here's what we do see. And bear this in mind, that this didn't happen. They clashed with state forces to the west of Dublin. They had gone to the west of Dublin to keep local forces tied down and to draw forces from Dublin City to enable the Dublin City men rise. But the Dublin City men did not rise, and we don't know for certain why not. There's many parts of the story we just don't know. But they did fight in Fairhouse, in Tallaght, to the west of the city, and did quite well. They did attack barracks at Churchtown and Stepaside, which are nowadays salubrious South Dublin suburbs. They clashed with state forces in Ballymacoda Woods in Cork. Four barracks were burnt in Tipperary by men led by Colonel Thomas Burke. In Limerick, the Fenians attacked Ardagh Barracks and Kilmallock. Now, Kilmallock had been attacked in 1798, it was attacked in 1867, and the grandsons of the men who did it in 1867 destroyed it in 1920 during the War for Independence in Ireland. Now, that's longevity, that's continuity, that's ideology, and that's persistence. And that's what you have to do if you've got an empire with a boot on your neck. So I'm not saying this is not inconsiderable. It wasn't militarily successful, but it did pass the torch, and it did show that the Fenians were in earnest, and overall, it was actually a positive force. Now, when news reached the United States that this had happened, Even those who had been in favour of the Canadian raids, which were not going as well as they could have gone due to renewed American government attention, they outfitted a brig, the Jachnal, and sent it maybe 30 to 40, 50 officers, we don't know exactly how many, to provide leadership and weaponry to rebels they believed were still holding out near Sligo and in West Cork. Now, in actuality, the situation had calmed down a lot more in Ireland. So by the time they arrived, which is the 18th of May, 1867, there were no standing forces of any considerable size. Now, the captain of that was a former US Navy officer, Captain John F. Kavanagh. He went ashore in Sligo, took affair with Colonel Ricardo O'Sullivan Burke, a man who spent most of his later life in Chicago and New York. More of him another time. But still keen to land their weapons and to find some way of assisting the Fenians, they sailed up and down the Irish coast. Eventually, a party, about 25 of them, put into Helvick, which is now part of the Gaeltacht area, the Irish-speaking area, near Dungarvan and Waterford. Most of them were rounded up. And this is where the fun begins. And this is where the propaganda aspect to assertive actions comes to the fore. Most of these guys were American citizens. All of them had been in the American military. Some of them were still in the American military, right? They were all Irish-born or Irish-Americans, and there's quite a few Irish-Americans amongst them. People didn't have to be doing this, but have come from that background where they're determined to step up. They put to sea as a Jachnal, but by the time they were landed in Helvick, they were Erin's Hope, which is, it's a bit romantic, okay, but they meant it. They walked the walk. The government reluctantly took convictions against 3 of them and tried to hold others and let them go and smack them on the wrist. But eventually they were stuck holding 7 or 8 men who said, no, we won't apologise, we won't give cognizance of good behaviour, sorry, we are Irish Republicans, and no, we're not going to go home quietly to America. So within 2 years they're all pushed out. Those who were released went on tours, lecture tours of Ireland, just to say, keep it up boys, we'll be back next year, that type of thing, right? That ship made it back to New York by August, albeit somewhat dishevelled and not with its full complement, but they got back. 3 Royal Naval vessels were destroyed looking for them, and basically they humiliated the Royal Navy, which was meant to be the most successful navy in the world, and had quite good cause for saying so at that point in time. So is that a success or a failure? Well, it depends how you look at it. It did encourage those who are subscribing funds, because they could see that their funds are being utilised. See, one big problem with funding illegal organisations which operate in secret is you're not really too sure if the $50 you give them is being spent where it's meant to be spent. Well, now you can see it is. They're outfitting the Jachnal, they're doing it. And if they can do it once, they can do it again. And if they can send 1 ship, they can send 10. So the basic viability plan begins to work for you. Well, I'm going to give you one more quick example, then I'm going to move on and finish up. The concern for the welfare of prisoners was always a big thing with Irish Republicans. You can see that all the way back to the 1790s. Those concerned with emancipating men in prison for political offences became known as amnesty associations, and that is the direct ancestor of Amnesty International, who of course was more or less inspired by Sean MacBride, who was former Chief of Staff of the IRA. So you don't have too many progressive judicial bodies founded by former leaders of illegal paramilitary organisations, but Amnesty International would more or less fit that criteria. It's changed a bit since then. But concern for prisoners, I mentioned to you that Devoy, the great John Devoy, and Kelly had sprung Stevens in 1865 from jail in Ireland. As Stevens's power waned due to the setbacks I've just outlined in very, very basic detail, there's much more to it than that, there always is, Colonel Thomas J. Kelly became the de facto leader. Now, Kelly was another American war hero, Irish-American war hero, from Galway originally. He was badly wounded in the face at the Battle of Carnifex Ferry. Could have honourably retired from the military on a good pension and not fired another shot in anger, but remained involved in the Union cause, was very well regarded by Grant. Very well regarded. So a person of the highest capacity, if you wish. He'd gone with his adjutant, Captain Deasy, another US Army Union veteran, to confer with English and Scottish-based Fenian centres in Manchester. Now, Manchester would have had about 40% recent Irish birth. I've seen some figures that have as low in the 1860s as 10% born in Ireland, but it's probably much more than that. Manchester and Birmingham have a very, very Irish character even to this day. Unfortunately, they were cited, not recognised, but they're arrested for vagrancy. Now, that's what you did if you didn't like the look of someone's cut their jib. You'd arrest them and then find out who they were. And they hit the jackpot here. They had the most important Fenian in the Northern Hemisphere, and they had his adjutant, DC. Well, the Fenians weren't going to take that lying down. And it fell to another US Army veteran, Edmund O'Maher Condon, to rescue them from a prison van, taking them to Bellevue Prison on the 18th of September, 1867. Now, just think for a second about that, right? You've lost your most important guy and another important guy. And he said, well, you know, that's okay. We'll rescue him. We've done this before. We'll spring them and get them back to America. It'll all be fine. And they did. They did. These guys were thinking big. Talk about thinking outside the box and getting it done. They're men of courage and conviction and action and capacity. Now, the thing didn't go perfectly, okay? The British had been warned there was going to be an attempt to spring them. The special branch groups were created to deal with the Irish and the Irish police in general and knew something like this was afoot. So they'd put a very large patrol on it. They put 12 mounted police as an escort to a prison van. It contained 2 Fenians, a couple of female prisoners, a male prisoner, a couple of others, all of whom were locked into separate compartments in a horse-drawn vehicle. The site used to ambush it was very clever. It was under a bridge on a main road, but the line of sight to it was, therefore the other police was obscured. About 30 to 40 Fenians and other helpers basically stopped the horses, drove off, beat off the police, who ran away and didn't get back in time to do anything, and eventually got the 2 Fenians out of the van. Now, there was a problem. Sergeant Charles Brett, very, very bravely, inside the van, who was armed, Sergeant Brett refused to comply with the Fenians. Now, they didn't know what to do. They had crowbars and axes and hammers, and they were whanging away. They called this the smashing of the van. Well, the van was ended up being literally smashed. They called on Brett to let the guys out. He wouldn't do it, which is very brave of him. So to sort of encourage the others, one shot was fired. There's a dispute as to whether it was down an air shaft or it was through the mechanism of the lock. This guy should have played the lotto. He got killed. Brett was killed by a shot that happened, of all people, to hit him fatally in the head. Now, the odds of this happening are astronomical. You're better off, getting on, a game show and winning big. It's never going to happen, right? So he's dead, and that put a very serious pallor on the otherwise successful event. After that point, his keys were taken off by a female prisoner, handed out of the van. The guys unlocked them, off they went. Escaped to New York. Now, the British went berserk, arrested dozens of people, traduced dozens of people, and eventually executed Allen, Larkin, and O'Brien. Now, Allen, Larkin, and O'Brien are the Manchester martyrs, and they're the first Irish Republicans actually executed since 1803. Because the British know you've got to be careful with Irish revolutionaries, because every time you kill them, you make them bigger. It's a bit like Darth Vader, you know what I mean? Or Obi-Wan, right? You make them stronger, okay? Because in our society, they're venerated, and they become on the pantheon along there with Robert Emmet, along there with Wolfe Tone, and all other great heroes. So killing them can make them more important. Now, Allen, Larkin, and O'Brien. Allen was a former officer in the US Army. He was an American citizen. Sorry, William O'Brien was. He'd already been caught on a guns charge, and he'd been let off on that due to his American citizenship. Well, he was still game. None of them fired a shot. The guy who fired the shot turned up in New York. I said, I'm very sorry about that. That was me. Total accident. We should never. Sergeant Brett was never a problem for us, right? That was ignored. A guy called Thomas Maguire, many witnesses swore he was at the scene and responsible. He wasn't. He was an Irishman who'd been 10 years in the Royal Marines, just arrived back from a 10-year overseas posting. He wasn't there. But yet people were swearing, lying that they was. It wasn't there. They were all Hibernians, and they're all Fenians. And there's huge cross-membership between the Fenian Brotherhood and the Hibernians. Later on, you see that replicated in the early 20th century. Now, they're executed in public, under a guard of thousands, amidst sort of medieval-type scenes. The British always slagged the French for the guillotine, but they had these guys lined up on the edge of a public execution on the wall of a prison, being shouted and jeered at by people who'd been taking drink, to an extent that British liberal opinion was outraged. They were defended unsuccessfully by Ernest Jones, a man who was an English political prisoner, a Chartist. That's the English Republicans who revived the agenda of the Irishman in England, seeking a democratic republic in England, something they still haven't got. Well, when O'Maher Condon was sentenced to death, later reprieved because he was a US citizen, and the president got involved, he said, God save Ireland. And when he shouted out, God save Ireland, Allen, Larkin, and O'Brien did as well. Then their supporters in the gallery did. And then in 2 or 3 days, one of the most famous Irish rebel songs of all time, God Save Ireland, was ringing out. If you look at any memorial in Ireland that's built in around the the early 1900s, because prior to the Local Government Act, Irish nationalists weren't allowed to erect memorials to Irish nationalists in Ireland by the British authorities. But if you see any phrase, if you look around that says God Save Ireland in either English, Irish or Omic script, and I'm not even joking, that tells you that the Fenians put that memorial up. So it became sort of their catch-call, and very famous. They had a mock funeral in Dublin, replete with grave. The bodies were not given back. They're buried in quicklime in a prison and later sent to a different prison in a total travesty of Christian justice. That also aggravated people. There were mock funerals for them in New York, all around the world. And to this day, the Manchester martyrs were the most important recent Republican martyrs until the 1916 leaders. Until the 1916 leaders, when more of that went on. Another man who eventually was arrested and emancipated was Colonel Richard O'Sullivan Burke. He survived into the 1910s, and Patrick Pearse, as emissary of the revived IRB in Dublin, met O'Sullivan Burke in New York City in 1914. But in March 1868, over 100,000 Irish people marched to come to celebrate the Fenians in New York City. That's a lot of people celebrating the Fenians in New York City. And this is where you start to see the momentum building of a mass-based organisation that had the financial resources to underwrite the Irish Revolution, which they did between 1914 and 1921. This is where it comes from. Now, by there, the Fenian Brotherhood had rebranded itself Clan na Gael, increasingly used from 1870 as the sort of slightly more refined and more focused upper leadership of people who still call themselves Fenians. In this state, famously, they were known as the Robin Emmet Literary Association, and we have here David Emmons, who's one of the best historians of the bloody world. I'm very jealous of him. He's a true authority on this. He's written a fantastic book about the Irish in Bute and other things. The clan in Ireland still kept using the Irish Republican Brotherhood designator, but they sent emissaries to the Atlantic City conventions, which are normally organised by McGarity in Philadelphia as part of this thing. Just a quick aside or two, then I'm going to finish up, right? As part of the more latter-day Fenian revivals, there was another convention in Chicago. I'll take my glasses off so I can read. This is 1895. Now, there was 10 men chosen. 10 men were chosen to be the new head of the Clan na Gael organisation in the United States of America. And one of them was J.M. Kennedy from Montana. Now, Montana had always featured into these things. Many Fenians, every single mining camp from California through Colorado had the Hibernians and the Clan. And many, not Ku Klux, the Clan na Gael, many of them were the same people. Now, there's a lovely little anecdote about this from 1917. 1917, of course, is when the Bolshevik Revolution succeeded. A man named Frank Robbins was in New York. Now, Frank Robbins, a few years earlier, was a founding member of the Irish Citizen Army, founded by James Connolly and James Larkin, more of whom along. He was dealing with Larkin when Larkin was in his sort of uneasy American sojourn. But here's what he says. Here's what he says about one particular meeting, if I can find it. Yes, this is with some Irish guys in New York City. It doesn't matter. Having left Larkin, I went up to see Liam Mellows at Mrs. Kerwin's residence and found there James O'Connor, the present city sheriff of Dublin. O'Connor had come across from the west and had stayed in Butte, Montana, for a couple of days. While the three of us were talking, James O'Connor suddenly said, "By the way, did you hear Larkin is going to Russia?" So this is just after the revolution. I said immediately, "I was with Larkin today. In fact, I only just left him a short while ago," and he said nothing about him. "Oh," said O'Connor, "that's strange. Every third or fourth person you meet in Butte comes up to your ear and whispers into it, 'Did you hear the news? The chief is going to Russia.'" Now, what you see there is that the Butte clan were intimately integrated with the national Clan na Gael structures, that they were in receipt of secret communications and open communications. Liam Mellows spent time on the run in Butte, later famously as did Eamon de Valera. It was a big part of the Irish revolutionary world. Colorado was important too, and the Fenians held an important convention also in Denver, which was a more Irish city than one might imagine. But Montana is where you had that sort of long-term element, which was boosted in a way with the connection with radical labour. The connection with radical labour also gave a separate strand of inner steel to the activities of the Irish in Montana, and particularly the revolutionary-orientated Irish in Montana. So I'm just going to finish up by saying that there's many more things I could have said, which I didn't say. Fenianism is not just about setting off dynamite in London. They founded the Gaelic Athletic Association. They were the force behind the Gaelic League, which by 1914 they'd taken over. Now, it's not necessarily a good thing, but that's telling what they were doing. In 1876, East Coast-based clan Fenians sent a Catalpa whaler to the western coast of Australia to take Irish political prisoners off the coast and bring them back to be feted in America. It's incredible that they did that. In the course of which they famously invited the Royal Navy to fire at the Stars and Stripes, and they were secretly hoping they would. That would have been good, right? In 1882, the Irish Invincibles, who were not a splinter of the Fenian Brotherhood, were actually a subunit of the Fenian Brotherhood in Dublin, assassinated the British Chief Secretary and his assistant, Cavendish and Burke. They're the highest level assassinations of British officials anywhere in the world. One of the guys who had harassed the Irish-American Fenians off the air as hope was the Detective Talbot. Well, Talbot was assassinated for doing that in 1871. The idea of personal accountability, of long-term retaliation, of violent assertion towards a democratic dispensation, that characterised Fenianism. The IRB in Dublin foregrounded in November 1913 Óglaigh na hÉireann, aka the IRA. And one of the reasons you know that the Óglaigh na hÉireann, aka the Irish Volunteers, are the IRA is that they're called that by the IRB. The IRB was the deep-seated clan on the other side of the Atlantic. They used the Fenian term IRA in 1913. And don't be fooled by some of the wishy-washy books about the Rising in 1916 in Dublin, largely financed out of America, and in some cases using American-provided weapons. And some of those who parted being in the mining camps of California, Montana, Colorado, including the most useful explosives expert in County Kildare, they were the IRA, and they called themselves that. And they also called themselves the Army of the Irish Republic, IR, which is the phrase used in the 1867 proclamation. They issued another proclamation in 1916, the famous one, which references the exiled children in America. And that's the Clan de Gael and those who thought well of her. So I'll finish up by saying, I know I've covered a lot of points there. I know it's quite complicated. That, believe you me, that's the tip of the iceberg. Anyone thinking of doing another PhD, or your first one perhaps, you have the information. It's here. The story has not been written, but don't allow these people to be written off as if they're some sort of madcap, ultra-violent fanatics. They were thinking, coherent, intellectual men of dynamism and action who wanted to bring Ireland into the 20th century, or then the 21st century, as an independent Irish Republic, and no more. Thank you.
Any questions? No questions. I have one for you.
Okay.
I was reading that it is because of the Fenians, or I read in it, that the British government changed their policy towards Ireland, that the whole origins of killing home rule with kindness, constructive unionism, was in response to the Fenian activity in the States. That in actual fact, the London Times was referring to the Irish problem as the Irish-American problem by the early or late 1870s and early 1880s. So now it was the American factor that was forcing the British to come up with an alternative to undermine the Irish nationalist movement. You agree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's my question.
And by the 1870s, when the Irish-based Fenians did not think that a short-term revolutionary strategy was going to work in the short term, well, even though they constantly prepared for it, they got behind the Irish Parliamentary Party, led by Charles Stewart Parnell, who prior to his death, his belief had joined the Irish Republican Brotherhood. So some of our constitutional leaders became disaffected and became more revolutionary, having been thwarted. They were the muscle behind the Land War, and the Land War by the 1890s, and certainly through the 1880s, had managed to extort from the British much better terms of land tenure in Ireland than the English had in Ireland. The English had in England. We got better land grants than they did. The Wyndham Land Act, for instance. So they were working on the cultural level, revolutionary level, but the latency of them, the fact that the British knew they were always there, and if they had to do something that they would, stayed the hand of the British very considerably. And a very early concession is one that's not often looked at, is the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland. The Anglican Church in Ireland was disestablished for Ireland, while it's been emphatically maintained in England. And it still is the established church. And that was a sign, listen, let's just back off here. You know, we're not going to force you into our churches if you don't want to go there anymore. And that completely reversed that policy of proselytization and discrimination. So the Fenians they were working all the time on many levels. But what made them invulnerable was, if push came to shove again, there'd be no more famines. There'd be no more absolute outright tyranny, because the Irish-American bloc were there to underwrite other efforts. And indeed, in the 1880s, which I didn't even talk about, various sub-elements of the clan, including that led by O'Donnell and Rossa, launched independent bombing campaigns against the British. And for the first time ever, they had a home front, because Irish-American Fenians were across the Atlantic to attack political and military and economic targets. Amongst the things they did was they blew up Scotland Yard, and that's why you have New Scotland Yard. Old Scotland Yard was blown up by the Irish-American Fenians. I could go on, but that's the violent fringe of it. But there's also the structured, organisational, intellectual aspect to it, as well as sporting, as well as cultural. It's not just about a stick of dynamite.
With regard to the home rule move, sorry.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, so I'm really struck by the fact that if you lived through the 60s here, you saw an awful lot of political activity that was intended not to really create a revolution, just to create political theater and make a point.
Yeah.
And a lot of this was going on here, clearly, and it extended over decades. And so I'm wondering, were there theoretical writings that were passed down? Are there? I realize
yes.
They're secret organizations, but
there are some. There's glimpses.
So if you're interested in sort of the political theory driving you, is this committed to paper somewhere?
There are aspects of it, definitely. But it's complicated the fact that these guys were often embittered because they've been in different factions. So you can't rely on them to tell the truth about the evolution of some of these theories and practices and what they really thought about John Devoy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you're right. A lot of this is deliberately done as political theatre, right? And the word used against the bombing outrages in the 1880s was terrorism. But as Brendan Behan famously said, the terrorist is the man with the little bomb. And the idea was, well, you're not going to come to our country and lay waste to our people, destroy our economy, and introduce us in our own country without us doing something, a bit of blowback in yours. And in actuality, they were incredibly reserved. You see, if they're going to shoot, if they're going to kill, they did, the Chief Secretary and the Under-Secretary, that means they can kill anybody. If you can kill them, you can kill anybody. And the British knew it. Many of those who acted against the Fenians lived in fear of them. The hangman who executed Alan Larkin and O'Brien was permanently expecting a knock on his door. And it's just a fluke that didn't happen, right? You have all of that. But as I say to you, I'm trying to give you constructive complexity here. They're working in different ways, in different sectors, simultaneously. And they weren't all responding to one specific strategy. But what you say is definitely true. They wanted to agitate and put the British offside. They knew they could never face them in open battle. And ultimately, they got the right combination of political expression through Sinn Féin and military expression through the IRA, which defeated the British in Ireland between 1919 and 1921. Defeated them. And that was something no one had ever done. Well, not in the modern times. American Revolution did a pretty good job. But in modern times, this was unheard of. And that was the death knell. That and the First World War was the death knell of the British Empire. Because the Egyptians were saying, the Indians were saying, if the Irish could do it in England's back garden, and there's 50 times more of us than them, we might be able to do something over here. And they did. And similarly in Africa, Peter Macroom in Ghana and all those other people, and to an extent even in Kenya, they were all very interested in the IRA. And the IRA is the modern Fenians. There's a biological connection going all the way back. In fact, you can trace a biological connection from groups of the 1990s back to the Defenders in the 1780s. That a member of each precursor organisation was the leading member of the next. And so too are some of their tactics, some of their strategies, which, as I said to you, are multifaceted. It's not straightforward. And it's hard to convey. It's hard for me to convey this without completely bamboozling it. And there's many, many other things I could have talked about and I didn't, but time is not on our side tonight. But if I've given you some interest in it, I'm pleased. Want to take one more question, or do you want to leave it? Yeah.
I'm going to ask, getting back to the whole thing with the relationship between the Home Rule movement and the Fenians. If you studied history in Ireland, you always learn that Charles Stewart Parnell, recognised the potential of America and arranged for the new departure with John Devoy, and then was basically the one who seemed to be controlling the Irish-American organisations. But if you look at some of what I've come to learn over here about the Irish-Americans, it seemed more like the Irish-Americans opened the doors of America to Parnell, provided them with the money to organise, control the Home Rule movement, and ultimately in 1914, when Redmond gave the wooden bridge speech, committing the Irish nationalists to the empire, it was the Irish of America pulled the rug out of Redmond and destroyed it, that Home Rule movement. So in actual fact, it was the Irish of America were running the Home Rule movement rather than the Home Rule movement controlling the Irish of America.
Well, I think that case can be made, and you've made it very well yourself. But I'll give you another analogue of that, right? The one element of the ancient order of Hibernians got colonised by the Irish Parliamentary Party, specifically the Devil Knights in Belfast. And because of that, the ancient order of Hibernians Irish-American Alliance, who were heavily Fenian, they organised rival Hibernian activities in Ireland and fought in 1916. Okay? And it's those structures and it's those sinews that is why it was possible for the Friends of Irish Freedom to be national here and raise $8 million for the Irish Republic during the war against the British. So absolutely, America is considerably underrated in this regard. I've always said it, and you're right. Did you have one last one?
So the term potato famine.
Yes.
Who came up with that term? Was that a British term to degrade the Irish?
It seems to have happened here by mistake, on the misconception that people starved to death in large numbers because the famine was blighted. We exported food, and this is not a conspiracy, it's a documented fact, hand over fist. Some food was imported, but never the equivalent of that going out. And it was going to the English cities, right? And I know why, because they couldn't feed their own urban poor. And they weren't going to have them paying higher prices because they weren't getting paid enough wages for them not to be revolutionaries, right? This is why Marx and Engels were hoping for the revolution in England. It looked much more likely in England than ever did in Russia. It just didn't happen that way. Both of them, by the way, lived with Irish women at different points in time. And the red flag was written by an Irish Fenian in England. Not that's a bit of a hard sell in the United States of America, but it just shows you the intimacy of radical life. About 3 million people of 9 were predominantly dependent or overwhelmingly dependent on the lumper strain of the potato for sustenance. That's due to decades of financial mismanagement of the economy by the British government in exile. In other words, they weren't in our country, they're from London. It's a duty of the government to regulate the national economy. They weren't doing it. They brought in an inferior version of the poor law deliberately to make it harder for Irish people to get any form of welfare relief. They exported under armed guard, and this is a fact, massive quantities of Irish food. And we keep finding more evidence for this. The more people are looking for it, the more you find. It's really quite shocking. So, no, people died because they couldn't afford to buy the food that was available. Because the export of so much Irish produce inflated the price of produce in Ireland. And even when they did temporarily bring in some Indian maize, which is maize, or corn in, right? The price that was made available at inflated 400%. And this is the stuff intended to make you ride out a bad winter. And on top of that, when the Liberal government, misnamed under Russell, came in, they cancelled previously contracted American imports of food, while still taking Irish food away. When the US Navy ceremoniously brought 2 shiploads of food to Ireland, one was meant to go to Scotland, by the way, but that's down to politics, the British wanted to tax them as for importation. So when you have that level of heartless attitude from your executive authority, who are openly disdainful of you, you become disposed towards extreme means. And no, people did not die because the potato crop failed. They died because they didn't have enough money to buy the food that was available. And they also died from exposure. They died from starvation-related diseases. They died in Belfast from cholera. They were dying from dysentery. All the things you get in a refugee-type situation in a primitive economy. Right, well, that's it. Thanks for coming.
Thank you all very much for coming, for joining us tonight. And again, thanks to our sponsors, the Friends of Irish Studies Programme, Sam and Julie Baldridge, and all of you for all your help here. We'll be doing more of these again in the spring. Don't forget, there's a concert on Saturday at 7 o'clock in UM Recital Hall, and on Sunday at 3 o'clock. It's our students. We got musicians out from Ireland, musicians here from Montana, great dancers, great singers. It's going to be awesome. It all goes to help the Irish Studies Programme. Cúna míle maithagh go léir agus slán a bhaile agus céad sé ríistimh le cúnamh de. As mar a gíam, nolig honna, nolig fehian as fevashiv. So I just wish you all a safe trip home. Hope you all get home safely. I look forward to seeing you again. If I don't see you again, have a happy Christmas. Slán, cúna míle maithagh.